The boy stood near the hotel's service exit, leaning against a marble column that feigned solidity but concealed cracks beneath the freshly painted surface. He wore a grey sweatshirt that was too big for his thin body and worn-out sneakers with soles beginning to come loose. No one paid him any attention. In Manhattan, that was a form of survival. On the other side of the lobby, the millionaire walked with the confidence of someone who believed the world functioned because he existed within it. Arthur Belmont didn't need to look where he was going. People made way for him. Employees smiled even before being noticed. He spoke on the phone, his voice low, firm, calculated, discussing the purchase of an old building in Brooklyn that would be demolished in a few weeks. Nothing personal, just numbers, deadlines, and profits. The collision occurred when the boy took a step forward. Arthur felt something bump against his leg and looked down, annoyed, ready to reprimand an inattentive employee or an inconsiderate guest. Instead, he saw the boy clutching a crumpled cardboard folder to his chest, his eyes too wide for someone his age. "Sir," said the boy with an awkward calm, "I can handle this myself." Arthur frowned. Around him, the movement continued. Luggage carts passed by, conversations in various languages mingled. Luxury went on indifferently. "Solve what?" Arthur asked, more out of disdain than curiosity. The boy opened the folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, printed copies of court documents, and old photographs. Arthur recognized one of the buildings in the pictures, the same one he had just mentioned on the phone. "You're going to lose money," the boy continued, "and it's not a small amount." Arthur laughed. A short, automatic laugh, the kind that comes out when something seems so absurd that it doesn't deserve any real effort. He gestured with his hand, calling for a security guard. "Boy, go play," he said, "and don't bother the adults." But before the security guard could approach, the boy spoke again, without raising his voice. "The foundation you use to reduce taxes is linked to a lawsuit filed in Illinois. The land you bought has an environmental issue that hasn't yet appeared in public reports, and the silent investor who entered the deal won't stay silent for long." Arthur's smile froze for a second. Just one. Enough time for something to shift inside him. Not fear yet, but unease. "Who are you?" he asked, now looking directly at the boy. "That doesn't matter," the boy replied. "What matters is that you're about to make a mistake that you can't undo with money." Arthur took a deep breath and let out a louder laugh, attracting curious glances. "Did you hear that?" he said, looking around. "A little profit." The security guard finally arrived, placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, ready to push him away. But Arthur raised his hand, interrupting him. Something about that posture, the firmness without arrogance, the absence of a request, was unsettling. "What's your price?" Arthur asked. "Because everyone has one." The boy closed the folder. "I don't want anything from you," he said. "I'm just letting you know." "Why are you warning me?" There was a pause that was too short to be dramatic, too long to be ignored. "Because when this blows up," the boy replied, "there won't be anyone left to laugh." Arthur let out a laugh, this time a genuine one, relieved. The tension dissolved too quickly, as if it had never existed. "Get him out of here," he told the security guard, "before he decides to predict the end of the world." The boy was led to the side door. He didn't resist, he didn't look back, he just walked out. Arthur adjusted his jacket and resumed walking. Minutes later, already in the private elevator, he commented to an assistant, "New York is full of overly creative children." But that night, while reviewing financial reports in his apartment overlooking the Hudson, Arthur stopped before a footnote he didn't remember seeing before. A cross-reference, an old case in Illinois, filed but not closed. He laughed to himself. "What a coincidence," he murmured. Nevertheless, he made his mark on the process, not out of fear, for control, and without realizing it, she gave the boy's warning exactly what it needed: attention. Arthur Belmont built his fortune by exploiting flaws, not in the financial system as he liked to say in interviews, but in the people who created it. Tired lawyers, overburdened tax inspectors, mayors at the end of their terms. He didn't bribe, he waited. Time always worked in his favor. In the United States, he had learned early on, patience was an elegant form of power. Arthur's apartment, high up in a glass building in Midtown, reflected this logic. Nothing was too personal. Expensive paintings, chosen by consultants, minimalist furniture, comfortable without being cozy. Each object existed to assert control, not to tell stories. Yet, that night, the silence seemed thicker. The name of the lawsuit in Illinois echoed in his mind as he walked from room to room, rereading reports already approved by 3 different teams. The next day, he summoned Marlene Ross, his legal counsel, a 50-year-old woman known for resolving crises before they made headlines. She arrived with her file neatly organized, far too confident for someone who was supposed to bring trouble. "The process exists," she said bluntly, "but it's technically inactive. There's no immediate risk." Arthur watched the city's reflection in the window behind her. "Technically," he repeated. Marlene noticed the tone. "There's a community association trying to reopen the case. Nothing concrete. There's a lack of money, a lack of influence." Arthur nodded. Community associations were springing up all the time. The system swallowed them up efficiently. Meanwhile, in a neighborhood far from the glitz of Midtown, the boy walked through narrow Bronx streets, past old buildings that had survived more through neglect than care. His name was Caleb. He was 12 years old and had learned early on to observe patterns. Not through exceptional talent, but out of necessity. When you depend on noticing something before it collapses, you pay attention. Caleb lived with his aunt, Eleanor, a night nurse at a public hospital. The apartment was small, hot in the summer, and too noisy for silence. On the kitchen table, printed maps, newspaper clippings, and notes occupied space where schoolwork had once been. Elena didn't like it, but she didn't ask questions either. She preferred to believe her nephew was just distracted. At school, Caleb didn't stand out. His grades were average. Teachers described him as quiet and inattentive. And no one realized that he spent his classes observing behaviors, schedules, repetitions. He had learned this from his father before he disappeared after reporting irregularities at a construction company in rural Pennsylvania. The case never progressed. His father never returned. It was while investigating old news about that company that Caleb first came across Arthur Belmont's name, a secondary investor at the time, discreet, always distant enough not to be directly mentioned. The building in Brooklyn wasn't just an investment for Arthur. It was part of a larger pattern of acquisitions in areas with messy legal histories, places where old lawsuits lay dormant, waiting for someone with too much time to wake them up. Arthur knew this, and he trusted his network to keep everything under control. What he couldn't explain was the unsettling feeling of being observed outside the traditional power structures, not by journalists, not by competitors, by someone without access, without a position, without fear. In the following days, reports began to be delayed. Small details emerged in meetings, a city councillor questioning permits, an environmental group requesting a reassessment of the soil, a bank asking for additional guarantees. Nothing serious in isolation. Together, they formed a constant noise. Arthur maintained his composure. He always did. But as he passed by the same hotel again where it had all begun, his eyes sought the marble column near the service exit. The boy wasn't there. Still, for the first time in years, Arthur had the strange feeling that someone was running the game without appearing at the table. The first real obstacle arose, as almost everything in Arthur Belmont's life did, via email, in language too polite to seem threatening. The bank responsible for financing part of the Brooklyn project was requesting an independent environmental audit. Nothing out of the ordinary except for the tight deadline and the demand for access to documents that had already been filed away as irrelevant. Arthur read the message twice, then forwarded it to Marlene with a single line. "Solve it." She responded too quickly, which did not reassure him. "Someone is funding these institutions," she said in a short phone call. "It's no coincidence." While the adults tried to identify the source of the pressure, Caleb walked among abandoned buildings, photographing old signs and almost invisible marks on the concrete. He didn't do it out of revenge or abstract justice. He did it because he recognized the pattern, the same type of negligence, the same outsourced companies, the same names reappearing with slight variations. He spent entire afternoons in the public library, using slow computers to cross-reference data that no one else had the patience to correlate. He didn't hack systems. He didn't forge anything. He simply connected what already existed, scattered excessively to appear harmless. Caleb sent information in fragmented form, an anonymous complaint here, a request for review there, a technical alert to an environmental NGO. Always verifiable data. Always enough to generate doubt, never enough to expose its origin. Arthur began to feel the impact in meetings. Partners became cautious. Lawyers started using conditionals more often. The project schedule suffered its first official delay, something that hadn't happened in years. "It's just local resistance," an advisor said, trying to reassure him. Arthur nodded, but the unease persisted. Not because of the possibility of financial loss, but because of the disruption of predictability. He had always been able to anticipate reactions. This time, the actions came first. One afternoon, Marlene showed up unannounced at the office. "We've found something," he said, closing the door. "Someone is cross-referencing old data from archived cases. It's not a journalist. It's not the competition." Arthur rested his hands on the table. "So who?" "We don't know." The word hung in the air, too heavy for an empire built on control. Meanwhile, at school, Caleb was called to the principal's office. Not for bad behavior, but for inconsistent performance. A counselor suggested extracurricular activities, accelerated programs. Caleb listened silently, nodded, and went home. That night, Elena found a letter from the city hall about a public hearing related to the Brooklyn building. He recognized the address immediately. "Do you have anything to do with this?" he asked, without accusation, just tired. Caleb didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence confirmed it. "This is too big," she said. "People like him don't lose." Caleb raised his eyes. "They lose when nobody notices how they're playing." Arthur realized something was wrong when he received an unexpected invitation to attend the same hearing. It wasn't mandatory, but his absence could be interpreted as an admission of guilt. He accepted. On the appointed day, he entered the council room confident but cautious. Ordinary citizens occupied the seats. Lawyers murmured. Activists organized papers. Then he saw. Sitting discreetly in the last row, the hotel boy observed everything with the same displaced calm. Arthur felt a brief chill in his stomach, not because he recognized a concrete threat, but because, for the first time, he realized that the conflict didn't come from above, nor from the sides. It came from below. The public hearing did not produce immediate decisions, but it altered the silent balance that Arthur had always controlled. The project was not suspended, but it entered a technical re-evaluation phase, a neutral, almost polite term, which in practice meant delay, exposure, and room for external interference. Arthur began to deal with a new kind of pressure. It didn't come from investors demanding quick returns, but from ordinary people demanding explanations. Long-time residents of the neighborhood, community leaders, environmental technicians. They weren't shouting. They were asking questions that were too specific to ignore. One of the most troubling subplots emerged within Arthur's own team. Daniel Reeves, a project manager too young to have been involved in the initial stages of the venture, began questioning old decisions. He demanded access to reports that no one had reviewed for years. Technically, he was doing his job. In practice, he was breaking an unspoken rule. Don't mess with what's already settled. Arthur watched Daniel with increasing attention. He saw no betrayal there, only naivete, the most dangerous kind. Meanwhile, Marlene began to face unexpected resistance within the legal system. Judges requested additional clarifications. Prosecutors asked for extensions to review documents. Nothing illegal, everything was slow. Time, which had always favored Arthur, was now becoming his enemy. Caleb, for his part, began to feel the weight of what he had started. The subplots he had created, accusations, hearings, reviews, began to take on a life of their own. Environmental organizations connected with neighborhood associations. University students offered technical assistance. People with their own agendas got involved. He no longer controlled everything. At school, a classmate found his files open on a library computer and spread rumors. Caleb was labeled weird, obsessed. Small provocations began. Nothing violent, but constant. The kind of wear and tear that corrodes slowly. Elena noticed the change in her nephew. Less sleep, more silence. One night, after an exhausting shift, she found Caleb asleep on the table, surrounded by papers. "This wasn't supposed to turn into a war," she said softly, so as not to wake him. Meanwhile, Arthur received an unexpected offer. An investor was offering to buy his stake in the Brooklyn project, absorbing the risks. The offer wasn't bad. It was safe. To end the problem before it grew too big. Arthur considered it for a few minutes. Then he refused, not out of pride, but out of principle. To yield would mean admitting that someone without formal power had forced their hand. This decision opened up another subplot. The local press began to take an interest. Small articles, independent blogs, interviews with residents. Arthur's name didn't appear in national headlines, but it repeatedly surfaced in footnotes. Caleb read one of those articles on the subway. He recognized phrases that he himself had indirectly helped to construct. He felt something close to satisfaction, immediately followed by fear. The greater the movement, the less control. Arthur, for his part, began to act outside the norm. He ordered investigations into associations, tracked the origins of complaints, and discreetly pressured political allies. He didn't cross the line into illegality, but he came close enough to get a metallic taste of the possibility. The subplots intertwined: the curious manager, the worried aunt, the organized residents, the legal delays, the emerging press. And at the center of it all, unintentionally, was a boy who believed he could solve it on his own, and a man who was beginning to understand that perhaps he couldn't. The turning point didn't come from a public scandal or a definitive court decision. It came from something smaller, almost invisible, a document forgotten in the wrong place. During a rushed internal audit, Daniel Reeves found an old technical report attached to a different project. It shouldn't have been there. The name of the Brooklyn site appeared only in a side note, but the content was too clear to ignore. Preliminary tests indicated chemical contamination in the soil, nothing conclusive, but enough to warrant further studies before any demolition. The report had been classified as inconclusive years before. Legally, it was buried. Morally, it wasn't. Daniel took the document to Marlene. She read it silently, her face hardening with each line. "This can't leave here," he said reflexively. "It's already out," Daniel replied. "Someone requested this material through the Freedom of Information Act earlier today." Marlene felt the immediate impact. There was no way to stop it. She could only react. Arthur was informed that same night. For the first time, there was no attempt to downplay it. He recognized the risk as soon as he saw the report's heading. "Who pulled this?" he asked. "An ordinary citizen," said Marlene. "A perfectly legal request." Arthur didn't need to hear the name. The next day, the news didn't explode. It spread. An environmental website published a technical analysis. Another reproduced it. A university commented on it. The issue gained legitimacy before it gained momentum. Caleb watched everything through the cracked screen of his cell phone. He didn't smile. The report wasn't something he'd found directly, but it was part of the path he'd opened. The system was starting to move on its own. The final twist came when the project's insurance company notified Arthur coverage was suspended until the environmental impact studies were completed. Without insurance, there was no construction. Without construction, the investment lost its purpose. Arthur attempted one last maneuver. He publicly announced his support for a full investigation, positioning himself as part of the solution. In any other scenario, it would have worked. But someone asked the right question at the wrong time. A local journalist cross-referenced the dates. He realized that Arthur had had access to the report years earlier, even if indirectly. It wasn't illegal. It was worse. It was willful negligence. At the next hearing, Arthur spoke firmly, but something had changed. His words were still controlled, but they no longer commanded the room. Caleb was there again, in the background. For the first time, Arthur held the boy's gaze for more than a second. There was no triumph in that face, only attentiveness. Arthur then understood the true turning point. He wouldn't just lose money, he would lose control of the narrative, the tool that had always protected him, and it all began when he laughed. After the turning point, every move Arthur made became calculated and reactive, something rare in his life. News of the potential contamination went viral locally, and partners who had previously followed his orders without question began to hesitate. Lawyers suggested caution. Investors sent discreet emails questioning the project's viability. Arthur realized that the city no longer bowed solely to his name. The Brooklyn Project, a symbol of his influence, was now under public scrutiny. Decisions that were once simple now required meticulous strategy. Each step needed double, triple analysis. Meanwhile, Caleb had become an invisible figure of constant tension. The boy hadn't expected his initial warning to turn into such a widespread chain reaction. He watched the unfolding events with a mixture of fear and fascination. His small actions triggered unpredictable consequences, involving people with real power, institutions, and Arthur himself. Elena noticed the change in her nephew. He spoke less, but registered everything. Every detail was absorbed like a calculation, a chessboard where pieces moved on their own. She tried to intervene, suggesting he rest, but Caleb couldn't. The complexity he had created now depended on her vigilance. At the other extreme, Arthur faced an unexpected dilemma: maintain his impenetrable stance or adapt to the new reality. He tried to control the narratives, organize formal responses and crisis meetings, but something eluded him. Small details slipped through the cracks. An unforeseen question in a hearing, a local news story reproduced on blogs, a comment from an environmental expert that couldn't be deleted. Even his relationship with Daniel Reeves changed. The manager, previously just curious, became an unwitting ally, identifying critical points that Arthur hadn't noticed. The young man seemed to understand the new rhythm of the game, albeit instinctively. Arthur realized he would need to use this unexpected strength without revealing vulnerability. Caleb, for his part, understood that each action had consequences that he didn't fully control. The subplot of the community involved in the project took on a life of its own. The residents mobilized, each meeting adding pressure on Arthur, without realizing that the boy was behind the information. Arthur felt something unusual: apprehension, not fear, but profound unease. His unwavering confidence wavered. That complex system he had always mastered now demanded his full attention, quick decisions and improvisation, something he hadn't done in years. The first tangible effect appeared when a revised report revealed minor irregularities, technically avoidable but politically explosive. The regional media picked up on it. Arthur realized he could no longer rely on money or influence to erase the problem. You would need to act differently. Caleb watched the events unfold silently, knowing that the impact of his actions was still developing. The boy realized it wasn't just about justice or anticipating mistakes, but about the network of human and institutional interactions that created unexpected consequences. Arthur's reaction, on the other hand, began to change. Instead of focusing solely on containment, he began to think about strategic alternatives, more cautious, more attentive, but also more vulnerable. He was beginning to understand that his invisible adversary, the boy, was not just a threat, but a catalyst for change that he himself could not control. The game had changed. The rules were clear. Every action would provoke a reaction, and nobody had absolute control. Arthur Belmont, accustomed to controlling every detail, realized that the situation demanded something different. Genuine adaptation, not manipulation. He could no longer rely solely on influence and partial information. To move forward, he would need to analyze the facts in depth, listen to unexpected perspectives, and accept that not everything could be predicted. He began interacting directly with environmental experts, without intermediaries. Before, delegating was enough. Now he needed to understand each report, each analysis. He felt the discomfort of depending on others' opinions, something he hadn't experienced in decades, but gradually realized the value in the diversity of perspectives. Each meeting, each site visit in Brooklyn was a lesson. Listening was not a weakness, it was a strategy. Daniel Reeves became an unexpected bridge. The young manager questioned methods and results, provoking reflections that Arthur would normally dismiss. Initially, this irritated him, but he quickly realized that Daniel's insights offered alternatives to overcome obstacles without compromising ethical or legal principles. The interaction was not only professional, but transformative. Arthur began to see beyond pure financial logic. Caleb, observing from afar, noticed subtle changes. Arthur now acted with prudence and care instead of arrogance and haste. The boy's presence was no longer just a warning, it was a catalyst for Arthur's growth, though he was unaware of this influence consciously or unconsciously. The millionaire began creating action plans based on concrete facts and direct communication. He involved the local community in transparent meetings, not as a formal obligation, but as a strategy to rebuild trust. Old Arthur, who always saw negotiation as the imposition of will, had now learned that cooperation and dialogue could generate more effective solutions than veiled pressure. Meanwhile, Caleb faced his own challenge. The impact of his actions provoked anxiety and doubts about the limits of his intervention. He needed to decide how far he could continue manipulating events without exposing himself or causing irreversible damage. The boy learned that acting alone is rarely enough. The network of people, choices and reactions is unpredictable. Arthur felt his awareness and emotional control growing. He hadn't changed his essence. He was still calculating and determined. But now there was room for strategic humility, risk awareness, and constant learning. The transformation was subtle but visible. Decisions that would once have been impulsive were now considered. Attitudes that once sought absolute control now sought balance. After weeks of escalating tension, Arthur finally recognized a simple truth. Life, even for a millionaire accustomed to manipulating systems, is not linear. Neither money, nor power, nor information alone guarantee victory. Adapting, learning, listening, and anticipating human reactions became his most powerful tools. Caleb, for his part, watched from a distance, pleased with the effects of his actions, but aware that the true resolution was yet to come. The boy understood that bringing about change requires patience, intelligence, and timing, elements he mastered increasingly better while Arthur learned to accept them. The confrontation, silent and indirect, had transformed them both. The boy had discovered the limits of his own impact, and the millionaire, the need for real overcoming. The battle, though invisible to the public, had redefined the power dynamics and prepared the ground for what was to come. With weeks of pent-up tension, Arthur began to move with surgical precision. Every decision was calculated, every step monitored, but the terrain that had previously seemed under his complete control now proved unpredictable. The local community, environmental activists, and regulatory bodies not only reacted but anticipated actions. The network that Caleb had helped to form took on a life of its own, creating simultaneous pressures that demanded innovative solutions. Arthur could no longer rely solely on internal reports or experienced lawyers. He needed to understand, in detail, every technical, legal, and human aspect of the project. Long meetings replaced quick phone calls, site visits replaced cold analyses. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable, but also more aware of his limitations. Meanwhile, Caleb continued observing, always one step ahead. He tracked Arthur's small decisions, analyzed patterns in the community's reactions, and anticipated the moves of the millionaire's allies and opponents. The boy was aware that any misstep could alter the final outcome. His presence, silent but constant, shaped events without direct intervention. Secondary subplots intertwined. Daniel Reeves questioned old strategies, suggesting more transparent approaches. Elena pressured Caleb to rest and reflect on ethical boundaries. Long-time residents sought information, creating increasing public pressure. All of this contributed to accelerating the pace and intensifying the tension. Arthur initiated a series of strategic meetings, including engineers, environmental lawyers, and community leaders. The objective was twofold: to restore control and anticipate crises. With each meeting, he learned to value transparency, direct communication, and active listening, elements he had previously underestimated. A critical detail emerged. A small inconsistency in the initial environmental report data discovered by Daniel could generate distrust if publicly exploited. Arthur saw this as an opportunity to act decisively, but he needed to choose between traditional manipulation and strategic cooperation. As the clock ticked, the pressure mounted. Every public event, every community meeting, and every technical analysis was a piece of the puzzle that would culminate in an inevitable confrontation. Arthur understood that the climax would not only be a financial outcome, but a clash between strategy, ethics, and intuitive intelligence. Caleb, for his part, remained alert to signs of weakness. He knew the moment to act directly hadn't yet arrived, but the growing tension was precisely what would shape Arthur's reaction. The boy perceived the change in the millionaire, no longer arrogance, but cautious respect for what was approaching. Preparations were reaching their peak. Arthur adjusted plans, revised decisions, and aligned resources. Caleb monitored, analyzed, and anticipated. Each piece was positioning itself for the inevitable confrontation, the moment when intelligence, power, and strategy would collide definitively. The stage was set. All the elements, characters, conflicts, and subplots converged on a single point: the climax. Nothing would be predictable, but every action taken up to that point would determine the final outcome. The atmosphere, the timing, and the emotional tension were ready to catalyze the story's resolution. The day of the decisive meeting arrived. Arthur Belmont entered the Brooklyn City Hall meeting room with a firm posture, but for the first time feeling the weight of unpredictability. The room was packed. Lawyers, engineers, activists, community representatives, and city council members. Discreet cameras captured every detail. The project, a symbol of his authority, was now becoming the stage for a test of strategy, ethics, and courage. Caleb, sitting discreetly at the back of the room, observed every expression, every reaction. His eyes analyzed patterns that no one else noticed. He knew that any slip-up from Arthur could accelerate the chaos he had been silently building. The first to speak was an independent environmental engineer hired by the city. He presented detailed data on soil contamination, emphasizing inconsistencies in the reports provided by Arthur. Every number was precise, every conclusion logical. The audience reacted with growing murmurs. Arthur took a deep breath. He didn't interrupt. He didn't deny it. For the first time, in public, he showed himself to be vulnerable. Not weak, but attentive. He responded with clarity and humility, explaining the next steps his team would take to correct irregularities involving authorities and the community in the process. The initial reaction from the audience was one of surprise. No one expected transparency from a man known for discreetly manipulating systems. But the most decisive moment was when Caleb discreetly raised his hand, offering a technical comment that complemented the analysis presented. Arthur instantly realized that the boy was there, not just as an observer, but as a presence that had guided the events up to that point. The shock came when a previously unknown, silent investor contacted the city council during the session, requesting that the land purchase be suspended until the situation was fully clarified. The unexpected decision seemed like a blow to Arthur, but instead of destabilizing him, it catalyzed his adaptability. He negotiated skillfully, adjusting the plan to keep the project viable while meeting legal and ethical demands. Meanwhile, the community reacted with growing support. Small details, previously ignored by Arthur, gained importance. The recognition of citizen participation, the validation of environmental analyses, and the demonstration of responsibility. Each action built trust, converting a potentially destructive situation into an opportunity to rebuild reputation. Caleb, observing the evolution of the plan, realized that it had reached an unexpected point of equilibrium. He didn't need to intervene directly to cause failure. Simply allowing Arthur to face challenges fairly and transparently had already transformed the outcome. The boy understood that intelligence and strategy could overcome brute force when combined with patience and observation. The climax unfolded in tense but decisive minutes. Arthur adjusted decisions, incorporated feedback, and responded with swift action, while Caleb and the community validated each step. The end result was not a one-sided victory, but a dynamic resolution where each participant, from the millionaire to the observant boy, played a critical role. At the end of the session, Arthur breathed deeply, feeling the relief of the unexpectedly positive outcome. He had not only survived the crisis, but had transformed the challenge into a learning experience, growing both personally and professionally. Caleb, silent, left the room with the feeling that his intervention had been effective, but also limited by his own respect for the invisible rules of the human game. The Brooklyn Project moved forward, but now under a new paradigm: accountability, collaboration, and strategic attention. Arthur had faced a test that no amount of wealth or influence could simplify, and Caleb had subtly led the change without appearing as a public hero. In the days following the climax, the impact of Caleb's intervention and Arthur's adaptation became visible on all levels. The Brooklyn Project continued, but now with rigorous oversight, reinforced environmental protocols, and active involvement from the local community. Arthur realized that success was no longer measured solely by profit or speed, but by the ability to manage crises ethically and effectively. Internal relationships also changed. Daniel Reeves gained trust and respect within the team, being recognized as a key player in maintaining transparent standards. Marlene Ross, though cautious, admitted that Arthur had learned to value cooperation more than absolute control. Small strategic adjustments replaced authoritarian impositions. The corporate environment became more flexible, adaptive, and less dependent on tricks and manipulations. Caleb, for his part, felt that the effort of his actions had generated real change. He wasn't seeking public recognition. His goal had always been to correct invisible imbalances. Seeing Arthur evolve from an arrogant controller to a leader capable of listening, analyzing, and acting brought him a quiet satisfaction. He understood that intelligence, patience, and observation could alter even the reality of someone who seemed invincible. Arthur, now more attentive and aware, reviewed reports and decisions with a fresh perspective. His initial arrogance had given way to strategic prudence. He was still ambitious and determined, but he had learned to value human and unpredictable factors, recognizing that not everything could be controlled by money or influence. The Brooklyn neighborhood, a silent witness to an invisible battle, began to feel the positive effects of the renewed oversight. Residents noticed concrete actions in environmental and urban improvements. The project, once a symbol of unilateral power, came to represent collaboration and social responsibility. In the end, what seemed like an external threat transformed into a catalyst for growth. Arthur not only overcame the challenge, but internalized lessons that would shape future decisions. Caleb, the observant boy, had achieved his goal of provoking change, but indirectly respecting boundaries and encouraging real learning. The balance between power, ethics, and intelligence became the new rule of the game. The story ended not with a one-sided triumph, but with the confirmation that conscious action, strategic patience, and careful observation can alter any system, no matter how much control is exerted. Months later, Arthur walked through Brooklyn, observing the project's progress with a different kind of attention. There was no rush, only an awareness of the impact of each decision. Caleb, now more confident, studied old maps and new records, satisfied that he had brought about change without publicly exposing himself. The boy and the millionaire never spoke directly about what really happened, but both knew that this silent confrontation had transformed their lives. The city continued at its own pace, while the lesson about attention, patience, and intelligence remained invisible, yet lasting. If this story sparked your interest, reflect on the details that go unnoticed in everyday life and how small actions can generate big changes. Share your ideas and experiences and subscribe to the channel. Inspire others to observe, question, and act strategically. Discuss with friends, family, or colleagues how attention, patience, and analysis can transform complex situations. And remember, even the smallest intervention, done with intelligence and ethics, can have a lasting impact on the world around you.